Project, the hunt for the world's missing ape-men. In the wild tracts of the Pacific Northwest of America, men are now out to try to kill the ape-man. Indeed, is this uniquely film of Bigfoot, the Yeti of the United States? Is this the footprint of the abominable snowman of the Himalayas? Lord Hunt of Everest fame is a believer. Mysteries from the files of Arthur C. Clarke, author of 2001 and inventor of the communications satellite. Now in retreat in Sri Lanka, after a lifetime of science, space and writing, he ponders the riddles of this and other worlds.
It may seem incredible that creatures like large man-apes can still exist in the modern world. Yet the evidence for this is now quite considerable.
It's in the high valleys around Mount Everest that the Yeti, the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, seems most vivid. For the Sherpas of the high mountains, there are no doubts. The Yeti is woven into their rituals and their lives. Kunjo Chumbi is the headman of the Kumjong village. He has seen the Yeti. In the monastery above the village, he keeps what he believes to be its scalp, preserved as a relic in a box. With some assurance, he imitates the Yeti's cry. That cry is listened to in fear by the Sherpas. 6 years ago, Lakpa Damani heard it close by.
A Yeti came and attacked me and threw me in the river. His face was very black and he looked like a very old man. I was unconscious for a couple of hours. When I woke up, I saw the Yeti had killed some yaks and a cow.
She says the Yeti had picked up and thrown into the river her.
The Yeti looms throughout the myths and legends of the Nepalese people. Desmond Doig, with Sir Edmund Hillary, led the biggest expedition to hunt for the Yeti. He found that the Sherpas had the most precise physical description of the creature.
To the Sherpas, he's got a conical scalp, rather pointed ears, splayed nose, he's shaggy, he's bald around the chest and his tummy, and has a fairly human face. He's very nasty-tempered, very, very nasty indeed, and is known to rip people apart if he gets a chance.
Doig's expedition wrote off the Yeti, wrongly, he now feels, as an Oriental fantasy.
I'm afraid our expedition was a great gaudy mess. Any self-respecting Yeti would have kept way, way away from us. We had 600 coolies. We had about 200 Sherpas, and there were about 40 of us in the most beautifully designed and colored anoraks. Our tents were all vividly colored. We smelt different, we looked different, we behaved differently to the local people, and the smells of our cooking must have horrified everything within smelling distance. Well, the hard, rather soulless results of the expedition was that the Yeti didn't exist.
Other expeditions have also failed to snare the abominable snowman. But for 50 years now, Westerners have continually been coming back with new testimony. Emil Wick is one of the world's most experienced mountain flyers. Two years ago, he was taking a party of Japanese tourists on a flight over Kanchenjunga.
I saw on one of the hills some tracks I have never seen before in my life, really. So I went closer with the plane. I was watching. Are there some paper? Are there some empty tins, cigarettes, whatever? But it was absolutely clear. Only the prints were there. And from there, 4 of these tracks went to the Chamlang side, to the north. And I wanted to follow also, but the lady which was sitting on my right seat said, "Captain, very sorry for that, but we paid the Kanchenjunga flight and not the pleasure flight for you."
In 1951, photographs of footprints were taken on the borders of Tibet by the late Eric Shipton and Dr. Michael Ward.
There was no doubt about it. They were unlike anything that either Eric Shipton or I had ever seen or even imagined before. They were very clearly etched in the snow. The snow was about, I suppose, 3 inches deep on top of hard ice. And you can see that there are 5 toes definitely outlined. The big toe here, second there, third there, fourth there, and you can see a small toe there. You can see that the actual track itself is very, very clear-cut. And you can also see that over here at the heel is obviously a place where there has been a lot of weight there. And I suggest that probably what happened was that the animal put down its heel there and walked. The dimensions of the print are approximately 12 inches long and probably something of the order of 5 to 6 inches wide. I don't think there's any possibility of there being distortions of other animals' tracks at all. The various ideas have been put forward that this one, for instance, might have been the imprint of 2 feet, one on top of the other, but I just don't think that's on at all. I just don't think that's possible.
This print was photographed in the Dudkosi Valley in 1978 by the leader of the team which first conquered Everest, Lord Hunt.
The creature had broken through some pretty heavy crust on the snow. It was deep snow on a rather steep little slope. And the creature was a heavy one because he'd broken through hard crust on which, as far as we were concerned, we could walk around without making any impression through the snow at all. You could see through the snow, in the soft snow underneath the crust, the toe impressions. I don't think they were bear tracks because the Sherpas, whenever I've talked to them about this, and in fact when I've been with Sherpas seeing tracks, they have been quite emphatic that these are not bears, that they are Yeti.
In pictures taken by a French Jesuit priest, Abbé Bourdet, the toes again show very clearly.
Ce n'est certainement pas un singe. Ce n'est pas un ours non plus.
It is certainly not an ape, nor a bear, because a bear has claws, and this creature has not. So I think it is a special kind of animal that we don't really know anything about, because we don't have an exact description. But I have spoken about it to some paleontologists, and they are rather inclined to believe that we are dealing with an animal from the pre-human era, that is to say, one of our distant ancestors.
The Outward Bound School at Ullswater is run by Squadron Leader Lester Davis, Royal Air Force.
That's great. That's lovely. Good, that's well done.
He was on the 1959 RAF expedition to the Kulti Valley when he too came across tracks in the snow.
It sunk in about 5 inches. I, with cine cameras and things, was weighing about 12.5 stone and only went in about 1.5 inches. I thought, well, this thing is huge. The snow had been undercut by this fast glacial stream and I fell in. And I had held my camera above my head because it came up to my armpits before my feet touched the bottom. Well, it was icy cold and I scrambled out and just beside these footprints, and immediately we suddenly realized this animal, or Yeti or whatever, it had just stepped out with using only its 2 hind legs. And the chaps at the British Museum, they said this establishes its height is about 8 foot and its weight is about 60 stone.
Sightings of the Yeti by Westerners are rare, but in 1970 the English climber Don Whillans was on his way to the conquest of one of the world's toughest mountains. Annapurna by the south face.
I heard what sounded like bird cries from at the back of me, and I looked at the Sherpa and he said, "Yeti coming, Saab." So I whipped round and looked up the mountain and I saw 2 black crows flying away and a black shape drop behind the ridge. Well, my first thoughts were, Christ, what do I do now? Grab the ice axe or what?
What he did do was photograph the tracks. Next night it reappeared and he was watching it again.
And then quite suddenly it was almost as if it realised that it was being watched, so to speak. Quite suddenly it shot across the whole slope of the mountain. It must have travelled half a mile in a diagonal line downwards, and it was obviously heading towards a rocky cliff or some rocky outcrop there. And it disappeared into the shadow by the rocks, and that was the last I actually ever saw of it.
So how strong is the evidence?
It is not beyond the bounds of possibility that a creature like the Yeti does exist in some remote parts of the world.
I personally now stick my neck out and say I'm a firm believer in the Yeti.
I think it's a very strong case to answer. Having eliminated bears in my own mind, I can find no other explanation but that there is an unidentified creature still to be discovered.
It's noticeable that the hard evidence comes from Western visitors and consists mostly of photographs of footprints, which vary considerably. However, we do know that melting snow can play strange tricks. As for the Sherpas, their stories of the Yeti seem inextricably bound up with their religion, and it's hard to separate myth from reality. In America, however, the evidence for Bigfoot is much more straightforward.
Indeed, Dr. Grover Krantz, one of the anthropologists who has studied Bigfoot, or the Sasquatch as the Indians call it, is so certain that a man-ape exists in the northwest of the United States that he goes out regularly to try to track and kill just one specimen.
I'm convinced that these creatures exist for a variety of reasons. One of these, perhaps the most important to me, is a careful study of the footprints that has satisfied me that in at least some cases these footprints could not have been faked. But more than that, there are sightings by reputable citizens, some by disreputable citizens, but the number of good sightings that seem to be unshakable is now numbering in the many hundreds that I am personally aware of, and they probably number in the thousands at least. The number of Sasquatch is very difficult to estimate, of course, but within the northwestern part of the United States, I would be inclined to estimate in the vicinity of 200, with perhaps at least an equal number in the adjacent parts of western Canada. If there were fewer than that, then it does not seem to be a viable breeding population. Any more than that, I would think they'd be seen more often. Here in the Pacific Northwest, there are thousands of square miles of empty, desolate country where nobody lives. Almost never does anybody travel through it, and something like the Sasquatch could quite easily live here, being only occasionally seen, and no remains ever being found is not at all surprising.
The sightings of Bigfoot spread right across the northwest United States. This is Washington State. Sergeant Larry Gamache was driving home one night with his family and sister-in-law, Kathy.
I noticed quite a distance ahead of me an object move out of the dense forest towards the clearing between the forest and the highway. And I started to slow then, and as I got a little bit closer, I noticed it was walking very much like a human. Arms down at its side, swinging just in a normal walking gait.
It just got bigger and bigger as we went closer to it. And it was hairy and just didn't look, well, I wanted to close my eyes, but you didn't want to. You want to look, you want to see what you're going to see, but yet you don't.
The most impressive thing was the human features in the way that it walked. The fact that the facial area wasn't really covered with a lot of hair. The eyes, seemed normal as I looked through the windshield at him. And the height, the size, just the sheer physical size of it, it had to have been, in comparison to what I can relate back to today, 7, maybe 7.5 feet tall. Because I had to physically look up through the windshield to see the face and the head. And I was in a pickup truck, so they sit up quite a bit higher than a car. So it was at least 7 feet, maybe 300, 350 pounds.
Bigfoot now emerges often enough to get on television news. This is KFYR, Bismarck, North Dakota.
It's here, in and around Little Eagle, South Dakota, where there have never before been any sightings of the so-called Bigfoot or Sasquatch, where the people of this small community are now becoming believers. There have been 17 sightings of the creature in the past month. The latest sighting was at the Shooting Bear residence on a bluff overlooking the town. Last Tuesday night, Hannah Shooting Bear saw the creature from her house while it was looking in the window of her daughter's trailer about 30 yards away. Elderly Hannah was the only one to see the creature, but her son-in-law is reported to have fired several rifle shots into the air after it had moved off. What do you think they ought to do about him around here?
Kill him. He might hurt somebody.
Despite that recommendation, the Bigfoot hunters want to keep him alive. Their plan is to lure him into an area where they can either take his picture or shoot him with a tranquilizer. They believe in the notion suggested by an outsider that Bigfoot is attracted to menstruating women. This bait consisted of some used feminine articles. Dennis Newman reporting from Little Eagle, South Dakota.
Across the mountains on the Pacific coast in Washington State, veteran hunter and Rockingham County police officer Kenny Cooper was driving along this road when he heard a weird noise.
I was coming down north on this road here, and I heard some noise screaming back in here. And all the time I was going along, he was screaming. And everybody in Whatcom County could hear it because I did have the police mic outside. So they were listening to whatever it was that I was hearing. And the noise that was coming from that creature is what was on the recorder here. We took that recording, we sent it into the lab to have it analyzed, and it came back that there's no metallic noises in the recording, indicating that it wasn't made by some kind of a machine. And they said there's no voice, no human has vocal cords enough to throw the high pitches and the low pitches at the same time that was coming from that.
But it was Bob Gimlin and his friend Roger Patterson out trekking at Bluff Creek in Northern California who were the ones to suddenly find a large hairy creature appear in front of them when they actually had a loaded cine camera with them.
We came around a bend in the creek, and there stood a big, hairy, human-like creature. It appeared to be between 6 and 7 feet tall. The creature looked at us for a few seconds, turned and walked slowly away. And it was kind of in a loamy type soil, left good footprints. It walked directly away from us at just a slow stroll, just like a man would be walking away from something downtown. It never did break into a run. Well, the animal appeared to be a female due to the fact that it appeared to have mammary glands. And the thing walked very agile, very fluently, and it had huge, bulky muscles. An overall description, it looked like a huge, hairy human being.
Well, English and Russian scientists have analyzed this film very carefully, and they've concluded that the stride is quite unhuman and be very difficult for a man to imitate. However, I think we showed in the beginning of 2001 that skilled mimes can make completely convincing ape-men. So this is not proven.
But the Patterson film did have backup evidence, which is now in the hands of Dr. Grover Krantz.
By far the most convincing evidence is the plaster casts that I've got here of the footprints. I'll show you some of them here. For instance, here is a track that was cast right after Roger Patterson made his movie in Northern California. The imprint of the foot not only pressed into the ground, but also in pushing off, it raised a mound of dirt in the middle of the footprint. And this indicates that it was a flexible foot, and a rigid fake could not have made this. That's not as convincing as this other track. This is a 17-inch track that was picked up in northeastern Washington state. And this is what was evidently a crippled individual, because here we have two tracks of the same individual. You're looking at the bottom of the feet. And this right foot is crippled. It is distorted lengthwise, bent, missing one toe. And most critically, the two bulges on the outside of the foot represent spaces between bones. And if this had been just a gigantic human foot, or some kind of fake like that, these bulges and the bone spaces should have been set farther back. The fact of where they are indicates that this is a foot designed with different leverage, a longer heel, shorter forepart, which is exactly what would have to be done to make a foot that would lift an 800-pound animal.
Homesteader Grover Krantz and his daughter Millie saw evidence that Bigfoot has a stride to match the size of its feet. They were out near their farm in Oregon when they saw some tracks.
We measured them. Dad had his rule. We measured him when we went up. He stepped 67.5 inches, which is a long step. And then when he went down, he came down the road, and when he stopped at the edge of the road, he went off the road into the timber, down into the rough brush and timber. He stepped 7 feet when he stepped down in there. And I followed him for a little ways down in there, but I decided I didn't want to go down in there and see what made those tracks.
And in one place, he come to a fence, about a 4-foot barbed wire fence. He just stepped over that like it wasn't there. I had to crawl through or under.
I think Bigfoot is an animal that we already know from the fossil record. I'll show you a specimen here. This is a cast of the lower jaw of what we call the Gigantopithecus. This lived in China about 500,000 to 1 million years ago. I'd like to compare this with the gorilla. This is a cast of a gorilla's skull, so you can see the size of this thing. This was an animal that probably weighed about 400 pounds in the wild. And just looking at the lower jaw alone, what's perhaps most interesting is from the underside of the jaw, there is a difference. In the gorilla, the two sides of the jaw spread only modestly as you go back because the gorilla's neck is so far behind the lower jaw. If that neck were moved forward, the jaw would have to widen to make space. In the Gigantopithecus, the jaw is spreading at a much wider angle, and the only obvious reason for that is the neck is in the way, and that means the head was set on top of the body instead of hung forward, and it's a fair presumption that this was an erect bipedal animal. So we end up with the description of Gigantopithecus being an erect biped standing perhaps 8 feet tall, weighing about 800 pounds, and being presumably covered with hair. This was too early to have cultural activity, probably no more intelligent than an ape, and this, of course, is an exact description of the living Sasquatch.
Personally, I'd be less skeptical of ape-men if there weren't so many of them. It's hard to believe that something like Bigfoot could remain undetected in America. If anyone gave me $100 to bet on it, well, I'd put 40 on the Yeti, 10 on Bigfoot, and I'd keep the 50 for myself.
Next week, the gigantic drawings only the gods could see.